So maybe I will welcome everybody on behalf of Father Joe and St. Jude Parish. I'm thrilled to see there are 81 guests joining us, which is terrific because we have an outstanding speaker this evening. And I want to begin by thanking Andy Parker and Janine Sismore. Andy is working the cameras, the Zoom master, and Janine will handle the questions from chat. So I will begin by introducing our guest. And thank you for joining us for the first of our fall series of Sharing the Light, the speakers series presented by St. Jude Parish. It's my truly great pleasure to introduce Robert Ellsberg, award-winning author, editor-in-chief, and publisher of Orbis Books, the publishing arm of Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers, who will share with us his personal reflections about the life and legacy of Dorothy Day. Nobody can do this better than Mr. Ellsberg, son of Daniel Ellsberg of the renowned Pentagon Papers, who at 19 took leave from Harvard to work with Dorothy Day at the Catholic Worker Community, which she founded in New York City. He ended up working for her for 5 years until her death in 1980 at 83 years of age. During that time, and due to Dorothy Day's influence and unbounded faith, Ellsworth, whose mother was Episcopalian and his father Jewish, converted to Catholicism and became the managing editor of the Daily Worker newspaper, written by Day to make people aware of Catholic social justice teaching. Following her death, Robert, who had returned to college, edited her selected writings. Later, he also edited The Duty of Delight, The Diaries of Dorothy Day, and All the Way to Heaven, Selected Letters of Dorothy Day. Robert received his undergraduate degree from Harvard and a Master of Theology degree from Harvard Divinity School before coming to Orbis in 1987. He's written numerous award-winning books, including All Saints, Daily Reflections on Saints, Witnesses, and Prophets of Our Time. His most recent book is The Living Gospel, Reading God's Story in Holy Lives. Apart from his several books, he has, for the past 10 years, contributed a daily reflection on blessings among us for liturgical presses daily, Give Us This Day. And very importantly, Robert is intimately involved on behalf of the Archdiocese of New York in preparing for Dorothy Day's canonization, something that we're anxious to hear about. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to present, on behalf of St. Jude Parish, Robert Ellsberg.
I guess that's my cue.
Yes.
Yes, you hear me. All right, good. All right, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening and who helped spread the word, and especially to my hosts in Pittsburgh. It's very nice to be with you even in this remote fashion, talking to myself and to my computer. I had thought that it would be a wonderful synchronicity to begin this evening to say that today I was in a special ceremony where I was going to be called upon to swear literally on a Bible. I didn't say what translation or edition, that we had completed the work of the Historical Commission in preparing the material for Dorothy's cause for canonization prior to sending that to Rome. And then this morning, they said the way some technical problem, we had to postpone that a little bit. So that interrupted what I had thought would be a great introduction to this talk this evening. But just imagine in your mind that happened today, or it will happen very soon. It's just some years ago now, actually around this time of year, when Pope Francis came to America. I got to see him celebrate Mass at Madison Square Garden. And before that, he spoke to a joint session of Congress, as you probably know. And it was a remarkable speech. It really bears frequent rereading. I think it was quite prophetic. He didn't know exactly all that we would see in the subsequent years. But what was really striking to me, of course, and many other people, was that the talk was all organized around four Americans, four great Americans, he called them: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., the Trappist monk Thomas Merton, and one Catholic laywoman, Dorothy Day. I tend to think that most of the people there in the joint session of Congress, if they'd heard of maybe 2 out of 4 of these, were scratching their heads a little bit about why the Pope was talking about Doris Day. But for those in the know, it was striking that he would have chosen or focused on a woman who was not in her lifetime generally spoken of as a great American, but in fact as a communist, a leftist, a very suspect American who had been on a list of. I'm just worried about my camera. It doesn't look like it's doing a good job. There we go. Have been placed on a list of subversive Americans who might have to be detained in the event of a national emergency, according to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. So here is Dorothy Day included in that group of people that the Pope evidently believes are Americans and Catholics surely should take very seriously. He said, these are people who help us see and interpret reality in a different way. And possibly this evening, I'll help us think a little bit more about and understand Dorothy in a different way. I'll quote the words that he used about Dorothy. He said, "I cannot fail to mention the servant of God, Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic worker movement. Her social activism, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints." I think that in just a few words, he actually was able to paint a very succinct and accurate picture of Dorothy Day and what motivated her, especially that integration of her faith based on her reading of the gospel, based on the example of the saints, as he said, and her passion for social justice and for the oppressed. Of course, he had to leave quite a lot on the cutting room floor there, but I thought maybe I'd like to talk a little bit about where that vision, where that animating passion came from in Dorothy Day. First, to say something a little bit about her background, which probably many of you are familiar with. Dorothy wrote 2 memoirs, one called From Union Square to Rome, and the other, her much more famous memoir, The Long Loneliness, which are both different versions of her life story and the story of her conversion. And in the case of the Long Loneliness, also the origins of the Catholic worker movement and its early history. But basically, Dorothy tells this story. In some ways, you could say it's like St. Augustine's Confessions, in which he viewed his entire life from the perspective of what was the critical turning point in his life, namely his decision to become a Catholic. And in that light, he could look over all the things, in his life that had happened before and seen how God was present, in that journey, in that story. And Dorothy does something similar, but without Augustine's constant regret and shame about all the sin, that he was embroiled in his early life. For Dorothy, she looks back, and it's really a loving assessment of how all the things in her life before, both the beautiful things and the tragic things and the hard things, the inspiring things, all contributed to her path to following Christ. And that included experiences in particular of her engagement with the poor and the struggle for social justice. Like me, she dropped out of college. Unlike Dorothy, I actually graduated eventually. It's one of the differences between us. But she left college after a couple of years, went to New York City, and became very involved in writing for radical socialist newspapers and really immersing herself in the protests and social struggles of that time with labor and with anti-war activities. She was arrested with suffrage protesters and put in prison for protesting in front of the White House. All of that gave her a strong identification with this cause of the oppressed and a sympathy and a kinship with all those, whether they are allied with Christianity or not, who are engaged in the struggle on behalf of the poor and oppressed. So that was very deeply rooted in her, great deep passion. But there were other things too. There were experiences of love, of tragedy. She had a terrible tragic love affair that resulted in an abortion. She didn't write about this in her book. We know about this from later biographers. After that, she apparently tried to kill herself twice. So all of these very dark and tragic kinds of experiences. But there were also intimations of transcendence and of some kind of glimpse of another kind of reality. And she writes, for instance, about the example of people of faith who crossed her path and the influence and the impact that they had. There's a very touching story in her books where she describes, even as a child, she was not raised in a religious household, but she had a friend who lived next door in one of the tenement apartments in Chicago. And she went in to find her friend, a little girl named Catherine Barrett. And Catherine wasn't there, but she found her mother, Mrs. Barrett, on her knees in the kitchen saying her prayers. And Dorothy was was embarrassed that she had walked in on something that seemed kind of private. Mrs. Barrett didn't seem embarrassed and just said, "Oh, Catherine's not here. Come back later, Dorothy." Dorothy backed out of the room with a sort of sense of kind of awe, as if she'd just come across some deep sort of mystery. What's striking is that story in particular is one that she would remember decades later, no long after her conversion. I guess as she went back and traced what were the influences, what were things that had an impact on her. And as she said, she didn't really understand it, but here was Mrs. Barrett, who had all these children living, kind of a hard life in this tenement apartment, completed her chores in the morning, and then got down on her knees to pray. And that her faith in some way seemed to ennoble her experience, her life. There was a dignity, there was a purpose, there was a wider context that was larger than just social conditions. And she kept coming across that often among the working poor immigrants that she lived among, especially when she moved to New York City. And the sense that there was something else there, even in a time when she was kind of immersed in sort of bohemian life in New York City. She'd stay up all night at parties and hard drinking with Eugene O'Neill and other writers and artists. She said she often would stop into St. Joseph's Church on 6th Avenue, Catholic Church, in the morning, where working people would go to an early morning mass before going to work. She certainly wasn't a Catholic, didn't know any Catholics, but there was something about the kind of quiet and the beauty and the mystery of what she was witnessing that touched her. And that was before all this, the worst of it was to come in her life. But then she writes about, now there are two great turning points in Dorothy Day's story, both very, very significant. The first is, of course, the occasion of her conversion. And that's when now she's living on Staten Island with a man that she's deeply in love with, great love of her life, and finds that she's pregnant. And she had been writing about what this experience of being in this happy relationship, she called it a common law marriage, though apparently that wasn't a term that would have chosen. His love of nature, he was a great kind of naturalist, botanist, and introduced her to, the city girl, into the kind of rhythms of creation in a way that really stirred her to a religious kind of impulse. And then she finds herself pregnant. And this time it strikes her as just an enormous gift from God, to participate in this mystery of creation. And this time she is determined not just to have the child, but to give the child something that she wanted for herself, that she desired, a sense of order, a sense of foundation, in that kind of wider spiritual universe that she had been sort of viewing from the outside. She wanted to have her child baptized, which is an extraordinary thing for somebody of her kind of social milieu. Her partner, Forster Batterham, had no interest in religion at all. It was a great source of strife between them. I really think of this almost as a kind of annunciation sort of, experience. And it's remarkable that Fritz Eichenberg, the German Jewish / Quaker immigrant artist who did the cover for her autobiography, The Long Loneliness, he chose a picture of the Annunciation, where Mary is pregnant and an angel is whispering into her ear as she's sort of sleeping, and you see this sort of trail that's already leading in the background up a hill up to Golgotha, to the cross. Dorothy always believed that a vocation always involves the cross. It always involves a kind of letting go, a kind of death to one identity for the sake of a different kind of life. And that's what happened here when her partner refused to get married, and she felt that she was called to become a Catholic. And it meant there's a very painful for her decision to separate and raise the child by herself. So that is the first big thing, this great sacrifice that she made, this kind of cleaving of her life, of a sort of before and after in some ways, that was a foundation for everything that came. But that before and after left her still confused about, well, what about all the things that I believed in before? What about the things I cared about before? And she carried that into the kind of desert for several years of wondering how to connect her faith with that passion for justice and for the poor. It got to a point of deep struggle for her, and it was resolved, well, not resolved, but the next great moment in this journey happened then when she went as a journalist to cover a protest march in Washington of the unemployed that was organized by many of her old communist comrades and friends. And as she sat on the sidelines watching this ragged parade of men, all united in a sense of dignity and fighting for a cause, she felt, why couldn't Catholics be leading a march like that? And it happened to be the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. It was December 8th, 1932, a very auspicious day to go to where? But the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, the basilica that was under construction. And there she prayed, and she said with tears and anguish that some way would open up for her to connect her faith with her commitment to the poor and oppressed. She said, I was looking for a synthesis of body and soul, of this world and the next, the kind of political and the historical and the mystical, the transcendent, the immanent, a lot of different ways you can look at that. How do you put those two things together? And clearly, in becoming a Catholic, no priest, no sermon that she'd heard ever seemed to point in that direction. And it was only when she came back from this meeting and she met Peter Morin, this French philosopher, hobo, kind of, who had all these ideas. He'd been looking for someone to collaborate with, and he was there waiting for her. And he began to indoctrinate her with this plan he had. And it took, I think, a while for her to realize that this strange figure was the answer to her prayer. And he encouraged her, first of all, to start a newspaper to to spread the kind of idea of the radical message of the gospel. Now, what is the radical message of the gospel? Well, what she'd been looking for, the synthesis of body and soul, this world and the next and everything, is right there in the central doctrine of Christianity, the incarnation, that God entered into our humanity. And Jesus reinforced that so strongly in that extraordinary passage in Matthew 25, where he talks about, I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked, you clothed me. Insofar as you did these to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did them to me. That became the foundation, really, the foundational text, I think, of the Catholic Worker that emerged. The newspaper was founded in May 1933, May 1st. The title, The Catholic Worker. Dorothy put this newspaper together pretty much all by herself, with Peter offering some ideas, some of which she accepted, some she didn't. And soon people began to gather, and they opened what they called a house of hospitality, which was one of Peter's ideas, to practice the works of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless. And that, could have been what the Catholic Worker was all about. And the fact that, it was conducted by lay people who did this without any special authorization. They weren't a religious order. They weren't nuns. They weren't priests. They weren't even directed by a priest or a bishop, but just reading, this kind of gospel mandate and living it out in the heart of the Depression. That would itself be a remarkable moment in Catholic history, though it would not be all that different than what lots of religious orders had done in terms of charity and caring for the poor. But Dorothy there was another aspect of it, which was that it was not enough just to care for the poor, but you had to address and you had to challenge and ask questions about a social system, a structure, an economics system, and the culture and values that underlie it that give rise to so much poverty and injustice. So the Catholic Worker was not just about, we should all care for one another. It was also, we should have a different kind of society. And that meant, joining in struggles with the workers and with the oppressed, and in the protests and the picket lines and the sit-ins and all of that. It really was picking up again on an idea that Dorothy had had even as a young person, as a child, when she said, when I first read about the saints, from one of her old Catholic friends, my heart was very stirred by all these stories of how they cared for the sick and the leper and the orphan. But she said, but there was another question in my mind. Why wasn't more being done to remedy the situation rather than just to care for, for its victims? She said, where were the saints to not just to care for the slaves, but to do away with slavery? It's a pretty radical a statement, and one that pretty much set Dorothy on a whole different level, different path than almost any other saints you can think of who came before, who they stayed exactly with. I mean, you have St. Peter Claver or something like that, who very heroically cared for slaves coming into African slaves into Lima, cared for them, affirmed their dignity, etc. But he didn't he didn't do away with slavery. He didn't do away with the capitalist system or the colonial system or whatever. You'd have to look at someone like Bartolome de las Casas, who prophetically kind of challenged that mentality of Christendom and the conquest back in the 16th century. But so Dorothy is, in effect, that question she asked, where were the saints that changed the social order? That was a question she was answering with her own life. And it shows all through this kind of that experience of that prayer that she uttered at the Basilica basically for her vocation, for the question, what am I supposed to do? Now, okay, you've called me to follow you. Now what? I'm a single mother. I take care of my daughter. I go to church. I write for Commonweal or something. Is that what this is all about? Is that why I made this huge leap, this huge sacrifice for that? She was waiting for some message of what she was supposed to do. And she found it there, and it was an answer to the question she had asked herself in her childhood: where were these saints? She set out to become one. And as a result of Dorothy Day having provided an answer with her life, people who come after her don't have to ask that question. They don't have to reinvent that idea of caring for the poor and also trying to address systems of injustice, structures of injustice that cause so much suffering and poverty. Now, there was a third aspect of the Catholic worker, and if these two, if is all she did, that would be great. It would be revolutionary, it would be different. But there was a third aspect of it that came very much, I think, from Peter Morin's influence. The idea that it wasn't enough just to complain and protest about all the things that are wrong in the world. A lot of people do that. But to exemplify and live out an alternative set of values, to create a different kind of culture, to live it out as if it were possible, to build a new world in the shell of the old, in an old labor slogan that she liked to adopt and adapt. Like to demonstrate what it would look like if we lived by values that emphasize solidarity, community, common brotherhood and sisterhood, generosity, radical generosity rather than the radical selfishness, competition, greed, acquisitive spirit that our economy and our culture is driven by, that lies at the root of this, of inequality and of the value in people by the basis of what they own or what they have. And people who have more are entitled to greater respect, greater dignity. Reversing all of those kind of hierarchies, instead returning to the kind of scale of value that Jesus lived out in the Gospels, in which those at the bottom, those on the margins, those considered of no account, are actually the first in God's kingdom. That was the kind of world that she was trying to live out, and she tried to exemplify that in the Catholic worker communities, but also in the farming communes that the Catholic worker established. Now, I'm trying to take a look here. I don't want to go on too long here. I want to talk about some aspects of that, that the Pope was alluding to when he says that, okay, she combined this concern for passion for justice with her faith, which was rooted in the Gospels and in the example of the saints. So that takes us into the realm of Dorothy's spirituality. And that's something that I think people recognize. Of course, she was a Catholic and she went to Mass and she prayed. She was very devout. She read the Bible, and they know that she cared for the poor, and they know she protested. She went to jail in her protests against war and injustice on various occasions. But where was this all rooted in? It was rooted in a deep and intense practice of her faith. And her faith was not, I don't mean that just in the sense of a devotional kind of or sacramental sense, although that was extremely important to her life and regulation of her days. Rose and prayed, every day for a couple of hours, read scripture, said the rosary, read from the breviary, fasted, went on pilgrimages, all these things. But for Dorothy, the practice of her faith was essentially in how she interacted with other people. We often think of great saints as people in terms of these heroic things that they did, and you might say, well, going to jail or something for protesting civil defense drills or with the farm workers, there's the consummate expression of her faith. But for Dorothy, her faith was lived out in very ordinary kinds of ways, in the effort to be more loving, more charitable, more forgiving, to restrain her own impulse toward judgment and anger. In that sense, just as Benedict called the monastery a kind of school of charity, she regarded the kind of Catholic worker community as a real school of charity, a school of holiness, where you had to make an effort every day to love other people. And she felt this was a matter of will. It wasn't just a matter of how you felt at the time. She felt that if you will to love somebody, you can do it. And if Dorothy could do this, it's not because she was just naturally such a loving person, but because she just really worked at it and really tried. Her favorite saint was Teresa Lisieux, not somebody we think of as a great social activist, as the Pope described Dorothy. Here was a young Carmelite nun who died at the age of, I think, 24, 26, and spent her short life in this cloister, but wrote this autobiography where she described her spirituality, what she called the little way, which was a path to holiness, in which the arena was simply the exercise of love in all of your ordinary everyday encounters and chores. Dorothy took that very deeply to heart. She thought that it was a revolutionary idea, and it was certainly one that she tested and practiced every day at the Catholic Worker. But it was also, she believed that it had social implications, that it was a message about the incredible power that lies in what is apparently small and weak and insignificant. And that goes for all of our acts of social justice, all of our work for peace, all of our work for a better world. It all begins with very small things: standing on a street corner, looking foolish, handing out flyers, going to jail for a day or two. All of these things were kind of loaves and fishes. And that was her approach to how you change the world ultimately. It's, I think, very similar to Pope Francis in a lot of ways. Pope Francis loves one of his favorite lines is, "Time is more powerful than space." In other words, there's more power in kind of planting seeds that will take root and will eventually bear fruit, rather than this idea that you have to occupy a position of power, and once you've got the power, you can make anything happen that you want. Dorothy, like Pope Francis, believed in the little way, believed in the power at the margins, the power of just dripping water that can dissolve the hardest monuments of human pride and power. And she took that very seriously. She was concerned about radicals who were only interested in making a lot of noise and being heard, and trying to clamor and claw for the most attention they could get. She thought that the powerful kinds of witnesses came in often much quieter ways. But it was really her practice and her exercise of these disciplines in everyday life that prepared her for the great kinds of ordeals and challenges on a larger historical arena that she entered. I'll say just a little bit about my relationship with Dorothy Day. As was mentioned, I came there in 1975 when I was 19. I only planned to stay a little while, but I ended up there for 5 years, as one does. And surprisingly, one of the things that happened within a few months of my being there was that Dorothy asked me to become the managing editor of the Catholic Worker newspaper, something that I didn't have any qualifications for whatsoever. The significant thing in that story for me was Dorothy's capacity to kind of see people and encourage their secret gifts, gifts that they had no idea that they possessed. And it wasn't ultimately my vocation to remain at the Catholic Worker, but she was definitely pointing me in my direction, the direction of my life vocation as a writer, as an editor. I've been editor at Orbis Books for 34 years now, and not just as any old editor, but as her editor. As Mary mentioned, editing 5 volumes now of her writings. And in some way that I can't really account for, because I'm not one of the people who knew her the best or the longest, or have been more faithful to her path. But there was some way as a young person that I received some kind of direction from her that has directed my life. And in reading her diaries and her letters, which I was privileged to edit, is how I really got to know her in a deeper way, even than I had in the brief time we were together. But so, I just wanted to mention a few of the things that about her that the Pope didn't mention, and that people may not know about her, what kind of a person she was. One, I think, was her great eye for beauty and the importance of beauty. Here was somebody who spent her life so much surrounded by disorder and squalor, and was not sentimental about that at all. She knew just how hard it was. But she had this eye for not just beautiful things like the opera, which she liked to listen to every week, or nature. She liked to go out to Staten Island, the scene of her conversion, whenever she could, and listen to the sound of the ocean. Not just a beautiful tree or a beautiful bird, but she had a way of being able to see beauty even in the midst of what seemed otherwise disorderly and chaotic and ugly. There was if you looked carefully enough beneath the surface, there was some kind of something that pointed toward the sacred for her, and that could happen in all kinds of ways. And calling attention to it was, she felt, a very important calling, because we shouldn't just get mired and look down at our feet in the mud and be only obsessed by all these difficulties. We should always be able to see and to celebrate some kind of something that pointed towards something better. And that could be on the moral sphere, just two people sharing something or being kind to one another, helping each other. She would call attention to these things, point them out to you. Look at that. Another thing was, her kind of conviviality, her enjoyment of other people. One time in her life, she contemplated going off and becoming sort of a hermit in the 1940s. It lasted for about 4 months, I think. She had to come back. She was meant to be around other people. She thrived on conversation, of interacting with people. She loved to talk. She loved to listen. She loved to ask questions. She was very inquisitive and interested in things. She had a great sense of adventure. You never saw her bored. You always saw her prepared for something new, a new challenge. So even in her mid-70s, she's starting a new house for homeless women in New York City, or taking on the IRS refusing to pay taxes, or getting arrested with the farm workers. And she loved to hear about young people and what they were doing. There was a kind of youthfulness to her. She got very old. She got, physically very frail, very limited. And yet there was some part of her spirit that could always just soar and take inspiration from some act of courage or idealism. She loved the kind of idealism and energy and instinct for heroism among young people. And that gave her a very youthful quality, even though she was very old, older than anybody I knew at that time. And I guess one more thing that I would say is that it surprises people that she was just very fun to be with. She had a very infectious laugh. It was fun to make her laugh, and she could take a joke, and she could laugh at herself. And she loved to tell funny stories. And when you were around her, you just felt kind of more alive. You thought that you could be a better person. You thought that it would be a great adventure to be a better person. And I think that's, when we talk about Dorothy as a saint, Pope didn't use that when he talked about her in a secular context as a great American who helps us see and interpret reality in a different way. I think that one of the things that the signs of a holy person is that they make you want to be better. They make you want to be a holy person, or think it's possible. I heard Archbishop Gomez said, "I don't know whether Dorothy's a saint, but she makes me want to become a saint." And I think that's one of the things that a Saint Francis or Saint Teresa or Saint Therese or other
I want now.
holy people like that, is that they open our hearts, they open our minds to different possibilities. I remember that Saint Ignatius was converted while healing from a war injury when all he had to read was a book of saints, lives of the saints. And at first he was very bored by them. But eventually he began thinking, what would it be like if I were to live like St. Francis or like St. Dominic, you know? And he went on to found the Jesuits. So, you know, Dorothy, I think one of her values is that she opens up so many different windows for us, so many doors about what it would be like if we took our faith really seriously, if we really asked what is God saying to us in the circumstances of our time, in the situation that we find ourselves in this moment in history. I think in particular of this time of COVID that we've been going through, and what, you know, Dorothy wrote about the importance of community and of solidarity, and of how things like this can make us perhaps wake up to the way that we're all connected and related to one another. And what would it be like if we took that seriously as a foundation for our society, for our culture, if we lived that out, even in small ways that she called a revolution of the heart. Well, maybe it's a good, I know there are a lot of questions and we're limited time. So maybe I'll leave it there for now and enjoy the conversation that ensues.
Janine, will you please present some questions to Robert?
Be happy to, Robert. Thank you so much. How enlightening. And nothing like a Thursday night really feel good and make us want to be better. So thank you very much. I think in your presentation of Dorothy to each of us tonight, you probably gave us all a picture of where we desire our better selves to exist. So thank you. We have a lot of questions. One came much at the beginning. Do you know, does she have a Catholic worker story here in Pittsburgh?
Well, there's a lot of history there of the Catholic worker in Pittsburgh, but someone else, Mary Lou or anybody would be a better position to answer that, I think.
Okay. There was, so you mentioned she opened a house of hospitality. You know, we houses of hospitality exist here, which are wonderful. I wonder, it almost seems as though that's where those ideas or thoughts were born.
I've been told, Janine, that there is one in Larimer, and probably Jenny Cunningham could speak to that.
Okay. Let me get to a question you just touched on at the very end, though. In mentioning COVID and the situation that the world has gone through in the past year and a half. And I appreciate, the question was, what do you think it would have been like to have her accompany us through this pandemic? You brought up some good points in that she would have liked to have seen, greater cooperation, yada, 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 community and solidarity. But since that hasn't happened, what do you think a message from her can be, or her life?
Well, she, was not a, pull-up bureau with kind of positions on all sorts of topics. I think, the Catholic worker exists regardless of whether Dorothy's here with us, and there are people who have lived through that experience. I really look a lot toward, in this case, the leadership of Pope Francis in this time. I think he's one of the people who made it, responded on many different levels. One, a deep sense of compassion and mercy, a heart that was very open to the suffering of the world, but also, pointed toward what he called the kind of other pandemic, the pandemic of poverty. That has so correlated to the impact of the virus itself, and the differential rates of infection among the poor and those who had to work, or those who were homeless. So he spoke about that, but basically, I think his message that a crisis like this is a challenge and an opportunity for us to think about something new, not just to go back to normal, as we call it, but to ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want to live in? And certainly this was an experience that showed this kind of global connection. It was not just in one country or another. You can't just seal your borders off. We are all kind of interconnected. And you can't just have a solution that works for the rich countries that's not going to also include everybody else. So I think that in his most recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, he writes a lot about what if we come out of this experience able to see one another in a different way and to build a different kind of society. I think that's the kind of thing that Dorothy faced, the challenge with the Depression or with war or with any number of kinds of social issues. It was not exactly that there that he had a program. She had a program for how to solve all of these things: housing, unemployment, whatever. It all came back to seeing each other as brothers and sisters. And what if we had a society or a culture that reflected that kind of idea?
Thank you. Here is a question here. The first turning point of Dorothy Day's life, her leaving her common law husband and becoming a single mother, must have been difficult, if not traumatic for her. And trauma often crystallizes one's spirituality. Mm-hmm. How did this heartbreak inform her work with the Catholic worker?
I think that it reinforced, this sense of kind of martyrdom, sacrifice that was right there at the heart of her faith, her vocation, that you had to pay a price, for your faith, and that emboldened her to, be willing to pay other prices, to take other risks, to make other sacrifices. None of them maybe seemed quite so hard, after that. I'll say just one little bit more about that story that is not in her autobiography, and I only discovered when I edited her letters, which was that she makes it sound as if it was very clear cut. She had to choose between God and man, and she chose God. But in her letters, you discover that she was writing him constantly over a period of 5 years, begging him to change his mind. And all that time, she was holding out this hope that she was really going to end up, in a happy marriage with Forster. They'd have lots of children and be just a happy a family. And that was her ideal. And it's extraordinary that it was the last letter to Forster in this kind of sequence comes in December 1932, when she says, I've come to the conclusion that it's not going to happen, and I have to just let you go, and I have to move on. Now, what else happened in December 1932? That's when she made that prayer at the Basilica with tears and anguish, she said, to find her vocation. And she came home and she finds Peter Morin that same month. And that's when it was like letting go of her heart's desire that finally allowed her to find her real calling. And if Forster had taken her up on that, we would not be here talking about Dorothy Day. Wouldn't be any Catholic worker. And so it's amazing to think about how, a vocation like that, sometimes we choose it, sometimes it chooses us, sometimes other people help us, choose it by the doors that are closed on what we really think we want. So there's a lot of mystery in that whole experience. But it is striking that, that this is a saint whose conversion was prompted by being pregnant and having a baby, but also that was marked by sacrifice and having to kind of go into the unknown, into the wilderness. And I think that also kind of instilled in her a sense of trust. You go through experience like that and have a sort of prayer answered, like Peter Morin coming into your life at just the exact right moment. It makes you feel that that there is some kind of providence at work, and that you can trust in that.
So you mentioned Peter. Somebody actually asked earlier on if you could elaborate a little bit about her relationship with him, or if there's somewhere where we can read more about that.
Well, in The Long Loneliness, she writes a lot about Peter, her mentor. He was 20 years older than she. He was a cradle Catholic from France, grew up in a kind of peasant family, had been trained by the De La Salle brothers, teaching order, had been involved in kind of Catholic social movements of his time before emigrating and coming to North America, where he kind of bummed around and read, and he was a scholar, but self-educated basically, and had come up with this kind of synthesis of his own of how to translate Catholic principles into action. And a lot of it had to do with this, what he called personalist, philosophy, which meant not relying on organizations or other institutions to take care of things, but to begin to live today by the values that you would like to see. Be what you want the other person to be. The world would be better if we all stopped trying to be better off, he'd say. He wanted to build a society, he said, where it's easier for people to be good. And he was not that interested in Dorothy's kind of orientation toward labor unions and strikes and politics. He said, strikes don't strike me. She still had the sort of class war kind of mentality. And Peter was kind of taking a longer view and saying that we have to kind of withdraw from the mentality and the ways of thinking and the values and the culture of a modern industrial capitalist society. He was, always remained kind of a peasant at heart, and so he favored these kind of farming communes and that sort of thing. Anyway, so he contributed a lot of ideas to the Catholic worker that became, I think, very essential. The houses of hospitality, the works of mercy, voluntary poverty, all of those kinds of things. He drew a lot of influences from European kind of Catholic renewal in France that he brought with him here. So he was not rooted in the American experience the way Dorothy was, and broadened her outlook and gave her what he called a Catholic education, to really learn from the example of the saints, how you don't need permission from anyone to begin setting out to live by the gospel.
Somebody asks if you can speak to her resistance to nuclear weapons and the early demand to go to air raid shelters and to duck and cover. And I understand we are reaching, if not have reached, the end of our time, but if you wouldn't mind answering another question or two, we'd be grateful.
Not going anywhere. Dorothy really saw, kind of prophetically, the logic aware of the violence of World War II was heading, with aerial bombardment and the obliteration of cities, and then the dropping of the atomic bomb. She was not one of the people who rejoiced at that news. And immediately she kind of moved into a new era for the Catholic worker, which was warning and protesting against the dangers of nuclear weapons at a time when among Catholics that was really quite exceptional. And that took a more dramatic form in the 1950s, 1955, year I was born, when New York began having annual compulsory civil defense drills, which everyone was supposed to prepare for nuclear war by going into an air raid shelter. And she said these were rehearsals for doomsday, and going along with it made it more likely and made it more acceptable, made us think that we could somehow survive if you were in an air raid. So maybe it wasn't so bad if you just followed the government, did whatever they said. She said the only peace is not using nuclear weapons, it's not having nuclear weapons. So she and her companions would go and sit that out, and she'd be arrested year after year and serve, small sentences of 5 or 30 days at a time. But yes, she was one of the, at that time, you could fit all of the people, all the Catholics evidently who felt as she did about this, you could, into one police wagon or something. By 1961, these protests got larger and larger. There were thousands of people, and they eventually stopped having them. But it continued to be one of her primary concerns.
Okay. We have a question about her canonization process or progress even. Can you elaborate a little bit on the process and?
The process of canonization begins in the diocese where a person lived, and in after the centenary of her birth, which was 1997, Cardinal O'Connor spoke about convening people who knew her to talk about this. I happened to be one of the people who was part of that conversation, and it resulted in his decision to petition Rome to introduce her so-called cause for canonization. That was accepted ultimately, and so she's on the first rung of that ladder, known as a servant of God. What happens then is a process in the diocese, authorized by the Vatican, to scrutinize her life, prepare a biography, interview people who knew her, examine her writings, collect all of her writings. And once that is done, which we're just about to finish, it all goes to Rome, and there's a Roman process begins, which if it's accepted, authorized, she would be declared venerable. And after that, the fun begins with miracles that have to be authorized. So I think that this, as I said, the cause will go to Rome probably in November. I think it will be surprising how quickly it goes at that point. The Pope is all primed and ready and waiting for it. She's quite well known there, and it's not as if she's just another, Catholic holy person. She's a person who so much speaks to the kind of vision of the church that the Pope is talking about, that I think that it will move very quickly. Once you're venerable, after that, who knows. But someone asked me, what are the odds that Dorothy will be canonized? I think I saw the question came up, will Dorothy become a saint? Well, canonization doesn't make you a saint. God makes you a saint. And canonization is only the church's kind of recognition officially of that. So it's like I saw a children's little riddle. What was the tallest mountain before Mount Everest was discovered? Well, the answer is it was Mount Everest. It was the tallest, whether anybody knew about it or not. So Dorothy, if she is, will she be canonized? Will she become a saint, be declared a saint? I would say odds are 100%. So you want to trust me, take everything you've got in the bank and wager it on that. I have no doubt whatsoever.
Fabulous.
If you care about that sort of thing, not everybody does. I happen to, but I'm not invested financially in that. So I don't mean to suggest that anything like that.
Dorothy Day was a strict pacifist. Is that position consistent with Catholic teaching?
Many people would have said no for centuries, although in the first centuries it was not only compatible, it was obligatory. Christians did not kill one another. Soldiers who became Christians, faced martyrdom. All of that changed at a particular time. There was a before and after Christianity became the official religion of the empire. And then suddenly it seemed to be that, that all that stuff about not killing, well, as long as it was authorized by the state, which was supposedly Christian, for a good cause and all that kind of thing. And then we had this just war kind of teaching that continues to the present. So there were always people like St. Francis and monastics, and then within the Catholic tradition who believed that killing was incompatible with being a Christian. Erasmus, the great humanist. But Dorothy was represented something new in the 20th century to espouse strict pacifism. And the question was not so much whether that's all, it was not a question of whether it was possible, obviously but it was, it was recognized that it is a legitimate option for Catholics. And that was ratified, especially, with the Vatican II and with the bishop's pastoral letter on nuclear war in the 80s, 90s, where they said basically, well, just war is one way, pacifism is another way that has an ancient tradition and certainly is consistent with gospel teaching of Jesus. So what's happened since then is increasingly the burden of proof being put on the side of justified violence rather than on the side of nonviolence. And that, it was maybe 80% bias toward justified violence, just war, 20%, nonviolence. It's shifting more and more where the burden of proof is much more on the any justified use of violence and warfare. And with Pope Francis now virtually going toward the direction of saying that the bias, the preference, the ideal, the natural attitude for a Christian should be nonviolence. And that's, represents a remarkable kind of shift in the balance of weight or something within church teaching. So Dorothy, who was an exceptional figure, I don't think it's ever going to come to the point where the church says you have to be a pacifist. But certainly the honor and respect for that position has increased, by leaps and bounds.
All right. On a lighter note, and maybe to wrap up before I pass back to Mary Lou, you said Dorothy had a great sense of humor and that she could take a joke. Did she tell jokes?
There you got me. I can't think of literally of a joke. She was not. She was just a person who found humor in lots of things and was able to laugh and had just a beautiful laugh. But I don't recall her ever telling a joke. No, she was not a real jokester.
Well, maybe we'll just take with us the fact that she could take a joke and laugh at herself, and I'll try to improve that within ourselves.
Okay.
I'm going to pass you back to Mary Lou. Robert, again, thank you so very much. There are so many questions, so little time. Thank you so very much for offering your time and your treasure and talent tonight to us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Mary Lou's muted.
Can't hear you, Mary Lou. Yeah, you're muted.
Oh,
There you go.
I was saying thank you very much for sharing your personal stories. And I have to tell you all how anxious I was about calling Robert the first time. And I said, Mr. Ellsberg, and he said, oh, call me Robert. And I was like, oh, okay. But I think Father Joe would like to speak for a minute, and then I'll close out by telling everybody about next month. So Father Joe?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. I personally was looking forward to this evening, and it's been wonderful. And especially everything you said, but the personal part, that was really very moving and touching. So thank you for sharing that with us too. I enjoyed all the questions, and the question about Pittsburgh, I want to make sure we provide the answer to that, because there are at least 3 or 4 centers in our diocese alone that trace back the roots to Dorothy Day and her inspiration of those places and the services that they still offer. So I'm going to get that on our website. So if you want to look that up, it should be ready in a couple of days. I want to mention to our students, if there are, I know there's some students, especially from Oakland Catholic, I want to thank them for participating, but all of our students, you're always welcome to our lecture series. This is our 2nd season. Wonderful way to kick it off, and our theme of sharing the light. So we have so much to take forward with us. I'd like to close with a prayer and then turn it back over to Mary Lou for final remarks. But this is the prayer inspired by the Holy Spirit, but written for the cause of her canonization. So I think these would be appropriate words of prayer now. God, our Creator, your servant Dorothy Day exemplified the Catholic faith by her conversion, life of prayer, voluntary poverty, works of mercy, and witness to the justice and peace of the gospel. May her life inspire people, especially us, to turn to Christ as our Savior and guide, to seek his face as she did in the world's poor, and to raise their voices for the justice of God's kingdom. We pray that you grant those favors we ask through Dorothy Day's intercession, so that her goodness and holiness may be more widely recognized, and one day the church may proclaim what many of us already believe: Dorothy Day is a saint. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Robert, I have two things to ask of you.
Mhm.
First of all, will you come back in another year and bring us up to date on what is happening with her canonization that only you can do?
Well, I hope there'll be some news. Be happy to share that with you.
Thank you.
You'll be the first to know.
And, oh, that's wonderful. And then the principal of one of our Catholic high schools has asked if you would be willing to let us share this recording with the high school students,
Sure.
those who couldn't be here tonight.
Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank
Sure.
you very much. And I was going to close with Pope Francis's remarks about Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Merton, and Martin Luther King, and Dorothy Day being the four greatest Americans. But you did that, and it was true. I just can't thank you enough. It was wonderful. And so on behalf of Father Joe and our Sharing the Light Committee, thank you all for joining us tonight. And may I ask you to please save Sunday evening, October 24th, when we, along with St. Mary Magdalene Parish, will present the exquisite music of Mary Lou Williams' Jazz Mass of Peace, live at Sacred Heart, with Deanna Witzowski, herself an amazing jazz pianist, directing a jazz quartet, as well as 12 singers, including members of the Mendelssohn Choir and the East Liberty Presbyterian Church. Advanced reservations are requested, and students are welcome free. So please see our webpage, stjudepittsburgh.org, for ticket information. Thank you, Robert, and thank you all for joining us. It was a great evening.
And thank you, Mary Lou and Janine and Andy, very, very much for making this possible this evening. You all did a wonderful job, so thank you.
Thank you, Father Joe. Good night and have a great evening.